but it didn't work out that way. Russell stayed with us until August 1st, 1959, whereupon the other radio station in town, WSAT, hired him away for the same job that we had created for him and through him as news director. He went to work for WSAT at an increased pay than and a different the different radio station, but the same kind of job in news and community relations. His daughter had a lot of those same skills. She was an attractive woman, and she was a good dancer. And there were people who wanted her to come to clubs just as a part of the team, and many men just wanted the chance to dance with her. They wanted to be seen on the floor with a stunningly attractive woman, which April McIntyre is, and still is. I haven't seen her recently, but the last time I saw her, she's still a very attractive woman. She could dance, but she also did an air show for us for quite a long time. She was on the afternoon program on WRDX for, I don't know, several years. And she was frequently paid to go dancing at night. Club owners would say, if you'll bring April to the dance, to the program you're doing or the event, we'll pay you additional money. And the money was paid to April. There was times that she could make as much dancing in an evening as I paid her for a week's work. That's who April McIntyre was.
Phil Kerr.
Phil Kerr. Phil Kerr came to work for the radios for WSTP, and Phil was a unique individual. There were people who found him difficult to work for because Phil Kerr would do precisely what I had asked him to do. I never blew his cover. He had the authority and the power in many cases, and he knew what I was trying to achieve. He knew what my philosophy was in programming and running and operating a radio station. But Phil Kerr also had some other skills, one of which is we were probably the first or second radio station in the state of North Carolina to be fully computerized. We think we did that before WBT in Charlotte by about 3 weeks. Others say, no, Charlotte did it, and of course they highly promoted it, and we didn't promote it, but we think that from the people we bought the computer from, Data Point Corporation, that we were first. Phil made it his point, his business, to learn how to master the kind of data that you could put in a computer program to give you a picture of your audience, the listener profile. All of those things were created by Phil Kerr. In the meantime, I charged him with one responsibility. If somebody doesn't cover an air shift, it's your responsibility to do that, which means whatever you're doing, wherever you are, if somebody is sick, if somebody fails to show up, somebody gets mad and walks out, whatever it is, I don't want to hear about it. What I want to hear is a continuous program. And Phil Kerr did that. He and John Hook had an interesting clash one morning. John called and said that he wasn't going to be able to make it, and that would Phil go cover for him. And Phil said, no, I'm not going to cover for you, and the next time you better remember what it's going to take for you to get here, and so you better not get up with a hangover. You better get up here and get your job. Well, Phil and Hook reached an understanding that day, and Hook began to understand that if he wanted to keep that job, and we were paying him decent money, if he wanted to keep that job, Phil Kerr made it absolutely clear, you're going to have to be here. That's the only, I'm not going to do your job, and don't He'd only been there a few weeks whenever he pulled this case, and this happened on more than one occasion. Other people would try Phil, and they learned to cover their shift, or else they could get covered over and somebody else would be doing the shift. Phil was an ex-military, and he and I got along fine because I'm ex-military. We understood each other, and he knew what I wanted, and we were precise and clear about it. And I have to tell you that I give Phil Kerr a lot of credit for having spent the time and effort and energy to help me and everybody else understand what beach music was and how we could go about exploiting it, because had he not worked with people like Hap Alexander and David Smiley and John Hook, I don't know what his relationship was with you, Curtis. Probably as hard-nosed as I'm describing about everybody else. There were things that you'd want to do and he'd say, no, we're not going to do it that way. No, Phil was a guy who had just enough military background to make me happy, because we understood each other, that excuses were not acceptable.
Mike Wayne.
You know, Mike Wayne came to work at the radio station as a result of a relationship with his brother. His brother worked at the radio station, and he went on to something else and recommended Mike Wayne. They were as two unalike individuals that I ever recall having met. Wayne was quiet. He was competent. He would do what you would ask and do it well. But Mike was always just a little bit reserved. He wasn't going to be out there where he could get shot down too readily. He deferred to his audience and sometimes to his fellow announcers, to the likes of which I remember one night very vividly that I heard this long stream of uninterrupted music. And I knew Mike was to have been off the air at midnight, and suddenly there was this uninterrupted stream of music. After about 30 minutes, I called the radio station and I asked him what was going on, and the guy that was supposed to come in and relieve him at midnight had called in and said he was going to be little bit late, but that he'd be there in a few minutes. Well, I listened again the next night, and he was not only 30 minutes late, he was an hour late. In the meantime, Mike thought he ought to get paid for covering his shift. He let the first one go and he didn't report it, and the guy got paid for it. The second time he told me that he thought he ought to be paid, and I said, no, you made the decision to cover for the guy. You should have called Phil Kerr. Well, the third night was when all the fun began, because the guy had other activities going on in the parking lot, and he never got to the air. As a matter of fact, all he got out of that night was the parking lot. We parted company, and Phil Kerr wound up doing his program overnight, as I recall. He'd worked the full day and gone home and had supper and gone to bed, and the phone rang at 1 o'clock in the morning, and Phil Kerr was on till 5. But that was the thing that Phil could do. Phil was very capable, very competent individual, and I probably never gave him the kind of, I thought I had given him the authority to do the kind of job that was necessary. But there were times whenever I have reviewed that and thought about that I should have made everybody else more fully aware of the role that I expected Phil to do for me. I learned early on that I could not do all of it. I learned also from an earlier experience that if I did one air shift, I would be expected to do other air shifts. And there was a period when I did sign-on on WSTP at 5 in the morning. I lived out in the country at the time. I got up at 3:30, and I didn't get home until about 7 at night. And I was beginning to get to be an old man pretty fast. Radio is a demanding job. You have to understand it runs 24/7, non-stop. And there are things that happen on radio that the FCC doesn't give you a pass on it. The owner-operator, the licensee, is responsible for what goes on the air 24/7. You don't get to duck the FCC, and that's one of the reasons that Phil Kerr and I got along extremely well. There were people who never understood sometimes why you had to fill out the log, why you had to sign the log, and you couldn't dodge that, as simple as that was. You had to record stuff that had to be entered into the log, and no excuses are acceptable. The FCC doesn't accept them, and as a licensee, I cannot accept them if I want to keep the license, and I have a lot invested in the license. Phil Kerr helped me see to it that that was done, and the only thing that I've thought about sometimes, I never made it clear to the rest of the staff the role that he played and how important it was. And that's hard to keep up because Phil was program director, operations manager for, I think, something like 16 or 17 years. And of course, the cast at the radio station during the 40 years that I owned and operated, my guesstimate is something approaching 400 people came through that radio station. And we had a turnover of about 10 people a year. And 10 times 40 is about 400. That's how I reached that number. I have a lot of the records still of people who worked at the radio station, but I also have found that I have gaps, records that were not kept, or I didn't succeed in bringing with me when I left the radio station.
Let me pause it just for.
One of the things that you review, and I think this is something of a review that you're asking me to do, Curtis, is you think about the people who were part of what you were trying to do. And one of the things that you learn is the role of a good engineer. Many radio station owner-operators operate with what is called a contract engineer. This is a guy who may work for several radio stations, and he only shows up when you have a breakdown. Well, if you have that kind of engineering staff, you don't have access to somebody who thinks in the long term with the evolving technology. And evolving technology in broadcast is a fact of life. I think in the 40 years I operated the radio station, I rebuilt it about every 10 years. Either studio facilities or equipment had to literally be replaced because that's how fast things were moving. But over the years, engineering played a very vital role. I still remember, I think, most of the names of the engineers that I worked with. Jack Eichner came with me from WFNC in Fayetteville. After Jack left, he and Ted Austin left and went their ways. The next man that came in was a fellow by the name of Gene Tommerdahl. And Gene Tommerdahl and I had worked together at WNVA in Norton, Virginia. And when he left that station, he went to work for Gates Radio Company, the manufacturer of the transmitter. And through him, we were able to buy a big high-powered FM transmitter. He helped us arrange the financing. After Gene Tommerdahl, we had a fellow by the name of Ralph Thomas that we got from someplace in North Dakota, Fargo, North Dakota. Then Paul Seeley was a temporary engineer. All of these engineers had roles. Then the longest